My name is Jessie Doppler, and I'm the coordinator of Healthy Diet, Healthy Life. And I'm really happy to welcome you all here again today to join us for part 2 of our webinar on ultra-processed foods towards a balanced perspective. We held the first part of this webinar in June, and due to high demand and a lot of interesting questions that could not be addressed at the end of the first session, we decided to do a follow-up. So I'm glad that so many people could make it. Maybe just to start, I would just like to run through some very basic housekeeping matters, the usual types of things, of course. I just want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded. So you will be able to receive a recording afterwards as well, but it's good for you to know. We would like to ask everybody to keep their mics and their videos off as well. And also, if you do have any questions, please use the chat box or the question box at the bottom for any questions that you may have. I would like to hand over now to my colleague, Yasmina, who is the Deputy Coordinator of HDHL. And I'm so glad that she could join us today to moderate this session. So thank you very much, Yasmina. I'd like to hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Jessie, and very, very happy to be here. Honored to be here. Welcome, everybody. We have a great program lined up as the second part, following up to the previous webinar on ultra-processed foods. But first of all, I would like to introduce to you the panelists that we have for today, whom some of you might already know, I'm sure. First of all, John Mathers. He's a professor of human nutrition at Newcastle University and also the director at the Human Nutrition Research Center, also the chair of the HDHL Scientific Advisory Board. And his expertise spans many things, amongst others, human nutrition, health, and personalized nutrition. So very happy that he is a panelist today. Then we have Kevin Hall. He's the chief of the integrative psychology section, laboratory of biological modeling. And his scientific focus areas: clinical research, computational biology, and neuroscience. And he's focusing research on nutrient content, on body health. And this way, he has also compared the effect of ultra-processed foods and non-processed food products on health. And he's done some really interesting, he's managed some really interesting research initiatives that were also covered in the last webinar. So very happy to have him on board as well as a panelist. And then our third panelist, Edith Feskens, professor in nutrition and metabolic syndrome at Wageningen University. Currently, she's focusing on combating malnutrition in all its forms globally, and in particularly in low and middle income countries, also including trade-offs with sustainability. So we're also very happy to have her on board today of the panel. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to John Mathers, who will also provide us with a reflection on the first webinar on this topic. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Yasmina, and I'll add my welcome to this webinar. It's great to have a follow-up to the first one because we had so many questions that there wasn't time to cover them all. And just for anyone who wasn't able to join the first webinar, I'll give you a brief summary of the 3 presentations. So we had presentations from Professor Carlos Monteiro from Brazil, from Kevin Hall from the USA, and from Edith Feskens from the Netherlands. And in his presentation, Professor Monteiro gave us a great introduction to the NOVA food classification system and to ultra-processed foods, UPFs in particular. He emphasized that this food classification system focused on the extent and purpose of industrial food processing. So it wasn't set up initially to look at nutrition, but it was to look at food processing. And Professor Monteiro noted that many UPFs are produced at affordable prices and that they offer convenience and they induce what he called a craving-like palatability. And together with global aggressive marketing, in his view, UPFs have displaced from the diet other NOVA food groups less processed foods. And Professor Montero's thesis is that by displacing these healthier foods from the diet, UPFs are a major driver of the pandemics of obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diet-related diseases. In his presentation, he reviewed a large body of epidemiological evidence showing associations between the consumption of ultra-processed foods and a wide range of non-communicable diseases. And importantly, he reviewed evidence not just from Brazil, where the system was developed, but also globally. Now let me turn to Kevin Hall's presentation, and in that, he addressed the question, how do ultra-processed foods drive overeating and weight gain? And he did this by describing the findings from a well-designed inpatient study in which the researchers compared the effects of allowing people to eat as much as they liked of two contrasting diets. One diet was rich in unprocessed foods, and the other diet contained a lot of ultra-processed foods. And very importantly, the meals were matched for energy, for carbohydrates, fats, sugars, and so on. And what the research team found was that when the participants in the study had access to the diet rich in ultra-processed foods, they ate more food, and not surprisingly, they gained more weight and they gained more body fat. And these effects occurred really quickly, within 2 weeks. And very interestingly, the volunteers were not aware of feeling hungrier or fuller on either of the diets, yet they ate more for breakfast, more for lunch, and more for dinner when they were eating the meals rich in the ultra-processed foods. And, which might be important, they ate their meals faster when they had the highly processed meals. And in the third presentation, Professor Feskens considered what should be done now from a public health perspective. In particular, she considered whether the evidence is good enough to include advice on UPFs in national or international food-based dietary guidelines. Now, this is a very big question. To help to address that big question, she broke it down into 3 areas. One was whether we could assess the intakes of ultra-processed foods from the diet reliably, and it's a challenging question. Secondly, she looked at the difficulty in interpreting the epidemiological evidence because of the heterogeneity of foods that are included in the NOVA Group 4 and many other factors. And finally, she considered the lack of clarity about the biological mechanism that may link ultra-processed food consumption with health or disease. Professor Feskens concluded that it's difficult to separate foods into healthy or unhealthy. In the end, it's about the amount of those foods that we eat that really will make a difference to health outcomes. So those were the presentations, and it generated lots and lots of questions, and we'll hope to answer some of those questions this afternoon. So welcome, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, John, for that reflection on the last, on the first webinar on this topic. We will now go into some questions, and the panelists will have the opportunity to go a bit more in depth because, as John mentioned, there were a lot of questions still at the end of the last webinar. So maybe to start off with you, Kevin, you mentioned during the first webinar that there is a potential link between ultra-processed foods and overeating. Could you maybe tell us a bit more about the mechanisms behind this and your research, and in what way this could lead to adverse health outcomes?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as was very elegantly described by Professor Mathers, our last experiment really demonstrated that these 2 diets that our research team designed that were varying in a huge extent in the amount of ultra-processed foods that were presented led people to consume massively different numbers of calories without them, being aware that they should be trying to change their body weight or anything like that. They were just eating to the same degree of hunger and fullness and satisfaction and eating capacity. And yet, for some reason, during the ultra-processed menus, they ate many, many more calories and gained weight and gained body fat. And of course, our study was not designed to probe what the mechanisms were, but we can go back and we can sort of do a post hoc analysis of what was it about the meals in the ultra-processed diet condition compared to the minimally processed diet condition that perhaps were the most significant drivers of that observed calorie intake difference. And so we recently published a paper in Nature Food earlier this year, trying to do some modeling analysis to tease apart various aspects of the diets or the meals in those two diets that may have been driving this effect. And one of the things that we found, which was kind of interesting, was we also compared those models with other ad libitum feeding studies in the context of minimally processed foods, but varying widely in their macronutrient content. And so what we found was pretty consistent evidence across all four of these diet conditions that there were several factors related to the meals themselves that caused people, or I shouldn't say caused, that were associated with people over-consuming calories. One of those factors was the energy density of the foods that were placed on the plates. So the overall meal energy density when you subtracted out the beverages from the foods. That was definitely a positive contributor to how many calories people chose to eat. Another was the eating rate of those meals. The higher the eating rate, the more calories somebody would consume during that meal. Another factor was the percentage of protein that was on the plate. And it was kind of interesting that it was in the direction opposite to what we initially predicted. We had heard a lot about the satiating and satiety-inducing effects of protein. Interestingly, more protein that was presented on the plate with each of the meals ended up causing people to consume more calories rather than less calories in our data. And that was consistent across all four different diet groups. And then finally, something that was quite interesting to us, especially in the ultra-processed versus minimally processed diet conditions, where we match for salt, sugar, fat content of the foods, and carbohydrate content of the meals, I should say, over the course of the day, was this concept that maybe pairs of nutrient thresholds being crossed, not individual nutrients. This is something that Dr. Tara Fazzino from the University of Kansas has kind of operationalized. She's defined quantitative thresholds for pairs of sugar and fat once they exceed a certain threshold, as well as pair for salt and fat, as well as the pair for carbohydrates and salt. And what she has said, set some thresholds that said when pairs of nutrients in individual foods cross these thresholds, she's called those foods hyperpalatable. Now, she doesn't have measures of palatability, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not that's really what's going on, but at least we have an operational definition of something that we can actually measure. And what Dr. Fazzino did was she said, I know that you match the overall diets for these different properties, but the number of foods on the plate that you presented to people, did those differ between the diet conditions? And sure enough, in the ultra-processed diet condition, we presented people with more individual foods that crossed these pairs of thresholds. And so that on the ultra-processed diet condition, I think it was a little above 70% of the calories on the plate were from these individual foods that were deemed hyperpalatable, mostly from the salt-fat combination, actually. And then in the unprocessed diet condition, it was more like, I think it was something like a little less than 50% of the foods. And so it turned out that when we included the number of hyperpalatable foods in our models, that was also a positive predictor, and it was comparable to the effects of energy density. In fact, there was an interesting interaction between energy density and hyperpalatable foods in such a way that if we presented people with less hyperpalatable foods on the plate, energy density had a bigger effect, and vice versa. If the energy density of the overall meal was low, then hyperpalatable foods had a larger effect. And those two factors, energy density and the number of hyperpalatable foods across all diet conditions, seem to drive the majority of the effect when we looked at the standardized parameter estimates of our linear mix model. So those two factors, in addition to perhaps percent protein and perhaps eating rate, seem to contribute. And they weren't unique to ultra-processed foods. It's just that ultra-processed foods tend to be higher in all of those different properties. And so I think that, by teasing apart now in a new study that we've designed, the relative importance of the non-beverage energy density, the calories per gram of food items on the plate, as well as the percentage of calories coming from these hyperpalatable foods, the ones that cross these pairs of nutrient thresholds. We hope that our new study that's ongoing now here at the clinical center, another inpatient study where people spend a month of their life with us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we hope to tease apart whether or not in 2 newly reformulated ultra-processed diets, still having more than 80% of calories from ultra-processed foods, can we actually normalize people's food intake despite the fact that they're still consuming more than 80% of their calories from ultra-processed foods?
Thank you so much, Kevin. Fascinating insights, especially this hyperpalatability as a positive predictor. So we're very much looking forward to your new study that's ongoing. I would like to give Edith, you have a challenge with your voice, but would you like to react?
Yeah, I can react. Yeah. I will continue, but Kevin, thanks for this useful, very nice information. Apologies for my voice. I think what you said on protein, I just spoke my mind to what members of my own group and Karen Ford in particular, and Kees de Graaf has done earlier on fatty and savory foods. They found that the combination of fat and savory foods was, the most well-liked, for example. This relates to your observation of the salt and the fat, and also to your observation of, let's say, perhaps the protein. Maybe that is, more in the savory foods. I don't know. We have a taste database, so it would be very interesting to look at the taste of the individual foods and see what patterns regarding taste is resulting. So yeah, I like that very much. I'm very curious about these results and see what elsewhere in the world is happening to try to elucidate this better. The eating rate is also still fascinating, I think, and maybe I'm already looking into the future. Next, maybe someone will ask me about the dietary guidelines, or we will talk about dietary guidelines, and I think the eating rate, the drinking versus eating the calories or the different types of foods is something that is the most, I would say, thing we should pay attention for, because that goes beyond what we do traditionally in terms of nutrients and in terms of foods or dietary patterns, and adds an aspect of our diet which has not been taken into account. And then in addition, Kevin, the combinations of the various things on our plate is also something, of course, which is very relevant for dietary guidelines. We make advice for a whole day, but so far the guidelines don't consider, let's say, the meals so far. And for something else, protein intake and sufficient amino acid absorption. We know that you need to have 20-30 grams of protein in your meal, otherwise the amino acids are not absorbed well. So I think in terms of future research, also more meal focusing research should take place, but that's not about ultra processed food. Thanks so far.
Thank you, Edith, for that reflection. John, may I ask you to react also to this discussion?
Absolutely. And Kevin, I'd like to follow up on the speed of eating side of it, because I think that's really interesting. And what I was reflecting on as you were describing it was the contrast with, for example, a Mediterranean style of eating where food is consumed slowly over quite a long period of time. And that's very different from the modern way in which we consume, very palatable things in a few minutes. And I wondered whether there was some interaction with the satiety system, that somehow or other our normal processes for judging meal size are disrupted when we eat these very palatable, readily consumed foods. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, and I think it's fascinating to kind of see the eating rate data play out in our models of the determinants of energy intake at the meal level. I would point out, though, that it is a minor component. It is not the one that is driving most of the effects. When we do a standardized analysis to kind of look to see, there was wide variance across the meals in eating rate, variance across the meals, and these various other factors. It was not one of the top three. It was, I think, in the bottom, near the bottom of the list of the contributors. So it's certainly an interesting idea. Maybe that was because of the very artificial nature of our laboratory experiment. However, what you're pointing out is that often meals are eaten in a social environment as part of multiple courses, and that is not at all what we are doing in this experiment, where basically people are allowed to do whatever they want during the eating period. So we don't restrict them to not being on their phones or not being able to watch television, but they do have to eat their meals alone in their rooms. Now that's very artificial, but I would argue a lot of people do eat their meals that way, so it's maybe not that artificial. But I think what you're talking about is, what are the effects of these social, environmental interactions between sharing food with others, having a conversation with others, and these other aspects, which I think are very important things to remember, that these artificial environments that we conduct in eating laboratories do not necessarily represent all of those factors, and that there is biologically plausible mechanisms by which you can postulate that there takes time for you to digest and absorb nutrients. It takes time for various parts of your gut to sense that you have nutrients available, and that the signaling to the brain, either through the vagus nerve or through hormones, takes some time to occur. And perhaps in conditions where you're just wolfing down your food quickly to get to your next meeting at work, your body doesn't have time in that period of that meal in particular to sense how much you've eaten.
Thank you so much for that reflection. And of course, despite what you mentioned, Kevin, despite the artificial settings in which these experiments take place, I think nevertheless it's providing some really extremely valuable insights into the discussion around ultra-processed and processed food. So I think very valuable. And as I mentioned, we look forward to the insights from your next study. And I would like to move on to the second question. Edith, you mentioned during the first webinar that in certain cases, bread, I think in the Netherlands, in certain cases, is categorized as an ultra-processed food according to the NOVA classification. On the other hand, so is a can of the soft drink Coca-Cola. So if the nutrient content of a UPF is beneficial, would there be a way to separate those UPF products from this category, maybe look at potential health outcomes? Could you give us some thoughts on that?
Yes, thanks. As I told last time, I'm not really fond of the NOVA 4 grouping at all. I think it will induce confusion, as it has been done now, because it's lumping all kinds of foods together and looking in epidemiology. Of course, there is limited detail on the type of foods which have been eaten, because the FFQs, the food frequency questionnaires, don't ask so much in detail about, whether it's from a supermarket or self-prepared or, ultra-processed or processed, so to speak. And that, I think, throws away the baby with the bathwater. So a lot of foods in NOVA 4 are generally considered in all kinds of food-based dietary guidelines all over the world as unhealthy. So the sugar-sweetened beverages, the cakes and the cookies, for example, the processed meat because of increased risk of certain types of cancer and type 2 diabetes, etc., etc. So if you look at what's known and done all over the world on food-based dietary guidelines, this will help you a lot. But to add then indeed other foods which are normally not regarded as unhealthy, like whole wheat, whole grain bread, to add that based on the fact that it's from a supermarket or not, blurs the picture. And of course, you can think it's a detail, but it's, I think, fundamentally, saying something fundamentally, what's fundamentally wrong with NOVA at the moment. So I think from that point of view, it should be linked better to the current, nutrition and public health nutrition knowledge on what is currently available on the food-based dietary guidelines. And apart from that, look into perhaps more detail in some specific foods. Like, you know, if we are concerned about additives, I'd like to see something which is difficult in epidemiology because we don't have so much detailed information on additives, on, you know, whether a bread I produce myself or a bread I buy in the supermarket is really less healthy. And I don't think so. We don't have the evidence at all, and I suspect what is there in the supermarket bread is also clearly not unhealthy. But okay, this gives the idea that we should be much more careful in this. And why do I say this? Because you can say it's a precautionary principle. You know, it doesn't matter so much, just go ahead. It's clearly associated Nova-4 with all kinds of diseases and unhealthy outcomes. But I think because it's not backed up by evidence and the causality is difficult for some of these foods, not sugar-sweetened beverage, for example, I think this also increases the resistance in other stakeholders, for example, the industry, but for example, perhaps consumer organizations or equity. Remember that the discussion we had in New York about the sugar tax, that it was people from the Latino community who were against this sugar tax because the sugar-sweetened beverages were consumed so much by that group, and this group, which is a little bit, you know, underserved, would be affected disproportionately. So not only from the food industry, but also from all others, you can get a backlash. While when you have firm data, you know, that is much easier and much better to, let's say, to retaliate on this. So I'm a scientist and I'd like to stick from that point of view to more or less the facts. So then I think we need to look at Nova-4 and any other index just critically with common sense and see whether it's convenient, but especially whether there is evidence for things. And having said that, another message I would have, and I didn't discuss that so much last time, but that's up for discussion maybe with people from the audience later. One of the things I see happening, and that is from my public health hat on, is that the ultra-processed food is also being used as a critique on the current food system. Now, I understand where that's coming from. I see what the industry has been doing, for example, in Latin America, with very irresponsible marketing campaigns and that kind of stuff. I understand that there is a sentiment against the big food, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that what they produce is unhealthy. And so I'm very, you know, quite critical on the fact that now two things are mixed and blurred. One hand, scare about health, and on the other hand, perhaps, you know, useful critique on the food system, and that this health story is being used to enforce that. And that is just an analysis I have myself, but I'd like to share with you, which makes also the discussion in our field difficult, because when I talk to people interested in etiology, like Kevin or my colleagues, Karen Ford, I fully understand where they are coming from, and would like to be precise and try to elucidate mechanisms like satiety and eating rate and palatability and liking. And on the other hand, I also understand the public health people that say, you know, we want to act now, precautionary principle, better safe than sorry, the flavors we don't need, so why just put them in, right? So, I mean, this is and that two areas within nutrition, so the public health nutrition and the more, physiology or etiology based, are now fighting, and the debates gets very, very intense. That's what I see, and I just try to lift that a little bit, that blanket, and say, okay, guys, if you just show clearly what angle you take and what background you're coming from, then at least you understand your, let's say, motives, and understand, your fierce opinion about something pro or against ultra-processed food. And this is something we did not add in the last time, but I want to bring this to the plate also for today as a useful topic. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Edith, on that reflection. Yeah, I understand what you see, that it's used as a critique of the current food system and the situation we're in. But I would actually like to hear, Kevin, do you want to react to what Edith was saying about the classification and also being used as a critique, and that we have to be careful not to throw away the baby with the bathwater in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, so I came at this from a position initially where I was highly critical that this extent and purpose of processing could mean anything scientifically rational to do with how we consider foods healthy or not. And it's clear that the motivation behind this was to kind of, it was to not just classify, but even from the get-go, without data, to suggest that the foods in this ultra-processed food category are deleterious to health. And as part of a large sort of multinational food corporations and part of the food system that Edith so eloquently described, as some parts are definitely problematic. But if we take a step back and say, okay, let's try to remove the original basic idea before there was any evidence that ultra-processed foods were necessarily bad for us. One of the things that's kind of interesting and nice about the NOVA categorization system is that it completely ignores the nutrient content. And the reason I say it's nice is because it's a complementary way. It's kind of an orthogonal way of looking at foods that then traditionally we've thought about in terms of nutrition science. And so you can have a complete lack of overlap. We could have a nutritionally very complete and seemingly very healthy composition that falls into the NOVA category 4 UPF, and then you can also have the opposite, right? You can have the conditions where it's not a UPF, but is a very nutritionally poor food that was in the category 3 group. So I think that this kind of complementarity of looking at foods from this perspective is kind of interesting and poses some very interesting questions about, if we remove the sort of stigma and the branding behind this category 4, and we just call it category 4 for the time being, so that we don't have to even talk about ultra-processed food. We have 4 categories according to NOVA. We have nutrient-based guidelines and recommendations, and we can now start to probe, where are there overlaps? Where are there differences? And is there still some signal in the noise of what has now become a mountain of epidemiological data? I would argue that there probably is still some signal, and that we should better understand that signal. And where we sit right now, from a sort of science communications perspective, is, I think, really important, because we are right now in a state where there's a massive amount of public health folks who sit on a mountain of evidence suggesting that NOVA category 4 foods are deleterious to health. There has yet to be, in my view, a good subcategorization of that group from a complementary nutrient-based perspective, which I think is critically important, and subcategorizing NOVA 4 group into different food groups, for example, within that category, and looking at their implications for health. But I think it would be a huge mistake at this point for the messaging to be to the public health folks and for consumers that basically we should just ignore that this NOVA 4 category of evidence exists, that it's not evidence. And that's kind of, I think, maybe I don't know if that was intentional on Edith's part or not, but she basically said there's no evidence. And I think the counter example is, well, we've got 1,600 plus studies, as Carlos has been documenting, of observational cohort or even cross-sectional data that point to NOVA category 4 consumption as being deleterious to health. And if we give the message to the consumers that there's nothing to see here, that there's problems with the definition, there's problems with these studies, and that we should just ignore this and say there's nothing more to do, I think that is going to be a communications disaster. What I think is a more rational approach is to say, look, there's probably something really interesting to learn here, and we need to devote some, really substantial research funding to unpack what it is that's underlying the these associations in all of these epidemiological studies? Is it just an epiphenomenon of the way that these things are measured? Is it some residual confounding in all of these studies that's responsible for this? Or is it subcategories of these foods that are particularly problematic? What are the mechanisms by which we see these relationships? How much of the increased risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, all-cause mortality, and various forms of cancers is simply downstream of obesity, which we might be able to understand based on eating rate and energy density and hyperpalatable foods and these other factors that we're studying. I think that what's missing in this debate is the public health advocates and many many of the public saying we've got to do something about this based on the precautionary principle. And on the other hand, people who are very skeptical of the NOVA system to saying, there's nothing to see here. We don't want to deal with this. The definition is problematic, and we just don't have the kind of evidence that we'd like to see. There is a middle ground which says, gosh, there's something potentially really important here. We're always underfunded for nutrition research, and if the epidemic of chronic diet-related diseases is bankrupting many countries around the world, we need to invest substantial funds to really try to understand what's driving this. And this new way of looking at things, the NOVA4 group, can be complementary to traditional approaches, and we should use that as an advantage to really unpack this.
Thank you. Kevin, Edith, I see you would like to react.
Yes. Of course, I am a quite moderate person myself, so finding the middle ground is also what I like. What I see happening in epidemiology is that indeed different results for different subgroups are being reported. So that confirms our hypothesis that it's not a one size fits all, the category 4. And that is already, like I said, what we know on the different types of evidence on which is present in the food-based dietary guidelines. And I also think that the call for more funding, I understand very well, and I think also that is a highly relevant thing also for epidemiology, not only for the good quality randomized controlled trials and like you do what others do, matching the groups as good as well as possible and see what happens and what changes. I must say that I'm a little bit disappointed at the public health epidemiology so far, because I think adjustments for nutrients, adjustments for energy intake rates, or for energy density for that matter, which is even more simple, and maybe also using that hyperpalatability score you have been using, would elucidate already quite a lot what is still to be found in from epidemiology point of view. So I also call upon the epidemiologist to do this in a more let's say in-depth way, and then from these 1600 I read them, not all, but I read many of them. I fully understand what is there. I must say that, and that is something new, Kevin, that I also saw some ultra-processed food being related to asthma and chronic obstructive disease, which for me brought in a whole new angle, because that was the first time I saw it was not based on a, let's say, obesity associated pathway. But okay, that is just for further study, I would say. So yes, I agree, but no, I don't agree with the fact that there is sufficient evidence so far from public health point of view. We need more on that as well before we start scaremongering the consumers and the citizens. That is what I am worried about.
Thank you, Edith, and thank you, Kevin. I'm sure the last has not been said, and this is a very interesting discussion with these two different perspectives that we will, I'm sure, continue to have in the future. But I would also like to ask you, John, is the real question now that we need to decrease the consumption of ultra-processed food products? Or do we need to make unprocessed or minimally processed foods, in that sense, more accessible, more affordable? Maybe you could shed some light on that debate.
Okay, so that's a very big question, and there's two parts to it. There's one about what could we reduce or what should we reduce, and already we know a lot about that. So there are lots of foods that are rich in sugar or are high in saturated fat, and many of those are within the UPF category. So eating less of those is already well founded in the scientific literature and it's part of public health guidelines. So I think we should be continuing to focus on reducing those foods. Sometimes they're described as discretionary foods. They don't add much in terms of nutrients, but they tend to make us fat and they tend to be linked with a whole range of poor health outcomes. So I think we can take action straight away. We don't have to wait for new research on that. We can do something about it. The other side is how we improve people's eating patterns in general. And this links to what can be done at national levels, particularly through fiscal measures. And many countries have been experimenting with ways of taxing some products that they prefer we didn't eat. They've not done so much about subsidizing products that we would like us to eat. And I would like to see both of those being applied. So sugar taxes on things like soft drinks is great, but what about subsidizing fruits and vegetables? That's never been tried at scale. So I think there's plenty of scope for novel work at a national level to do that. So I'm very much in favor of taking what we're learning from NOVA to help us to do better studies, but not to wait for the outcomes of those studies before we take some action. And the action's really around reinforcing the public health messages that we already know and making sure that they're taken on board.
Thank you, John, for that reflection. And interesting that you mentioned taxing and subsidizing. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Edith, but in the Netherlands, the VAT lowering hasn't really come through yet.
Oh, this is such a nightmare. We had such a good plan. And then there was a committee, and then they started arguing for 1.5 years about the real definition of fruits and vegetables, which is a shame. And of course, yeah, we should have done this also better in the Netherlands, but that is, then our food system works against us, because how to introduce a new tax, so to speak, you need all the stakeholders involved, and that is well, maybe also lack of power of the government, or maybe also lack of motivation of some parts of the government. I think for looking at our food environment, we need quite powerful governments and brave governments who are not succumbing to, let's say, lobbyists or power from other forces in the field. But yeah, that is how it is. But it is unfortunate. I completely agree.
Yes, but who knows, in the future, perhaps.
Yeah.
And maybe to continue with you, Edith, you mentioned already briefly national dietary guidelines, but could you elaborate whether it's possible to include recommendations about UPF consumption in those in one way or another?
Yes, I think theoretically that can be done quite easily, not as I think NOVA 4. Because that, like I said, I don't condone that based on the evidence. But for the foods which we have evidence from either substantial research, epidemiological and trial results, and other evidence based more from the classic nutrition and physiology, I think we can do what we do, for example, in the Netherlands and in other countries, sugar sweetened beverages, right? Processed meat is being mentioned. In our food-based dietary guidelines, cakes and cookies are the discretionary calories, so not for every day, and so on and so on. So I think from all the foods I see in NOVA 4 are taken up in some extent already in the food-based dietary guidelines. Now, if you think about food labeling, you didn't ask that me, Jasmina, but I saw a question in the chat about Nutri-Score. I think that's more problematic. Oh, well, more problematic. I mean, there's now this nice study which shows that if you have the Nutri-Score, which is popular in Europe, and with this nice black square around it to indicate it's an ultra-processed food. At least the consumer understands that. Whether that really will help in making the final food choice more healthy, I'm not completely sure, but as to what extent they are in agreement with the food-based dietary guidelines, it should work. But again, there is a discrepancy between the food-based dietary guidelines in the various countries and the Nutri-Score, and also with Nova 4. So it gets a little bit complicated for the consumer. But the middle ground is there are many foods about which everybody agrees, they should be consumed in moderation or consumed not at all. I mean, there is not much, let's say, confusion about that. So from that aspect, do it sensibly, it's possible.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Thanks, Edith. Is there any, would you like to reflect on that, Kevin?
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk so much about policy. That's a little out of my wheelhouse as a government scientist here at the NIH. I mean, I will note that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is currently looking at evidence with regard to ultra-processed foods and obesity. That has been an interesting thing to watch from afar because there has been a huge amount of industry pushback on just the idea of considering the evidence, which I think from a messaging standpoint to the public sends a very interesting message that you have a group that is obviously very concerned about this category of foods, Nova 4 category, and what that might mean for their businesses. And the idea that they are pushing back on a guideline committee, even considering the evidence or lack thereof, seems, from a messaging standpoint, a little problematic from my view. And so I think that, again, one of the things that is really important to consider is that, I don't think we should ignore the evidence that exists. There is evidence and it should be evaluated. And can we do better? Yes. And maybe that's part of the recommendations, is that we need a stronger evidence base. We need to support research both on the epidemiological side as well as on the more mechanistic and controlled trial side of things to really unpack this. But to pretend that there is no evidence and that we shouldn't even bother evaluating the evidence that's currently there and that there's really nothing to see here and that this discussion shouldn't even be taking place is, I think, hugely problematic, especially from a messaging standpoint.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, so using the evidence that we do already have to act on it. I will also go to the chat because there was some question. Oh, sorry, John, you had a reaction.
Yes, yeah, just to say that clearly this is an area which has exercised a number of national governments, and very recently the Scientific Advisory Committee for Nutrition in the UK undertook a review of the area, and they of course acknowledged the extent of the evidence linking ultra-processed foods and a whole range of health outcomes. But they decided that the evidence was not sufficiently good to change any of the recommendations because of the kind of uncertainties that Edith was speaking about a few minutes ago. But I think what they did acknowledge, and which I think is really important, is that this is highlighting something which we perhaps haven't looked at before. And I think this is the point that Kevin was trying to make. There may be something that's been missing, and this may be the stimulus for novel approaches to research on food and health links. And if we can take that opportunity, I think that would be a real step forward.
Yes, thank you, John. Yeah, so the evidence was in this particular study you mentioned wasn't sufficient to change the dietary guidelines. Yeah,
that's correct. The UK committee that looks at these things decided that it was premature to bring ultra-processed foods into the dietary guidelines, but they acknowledged there was something here that needed further research.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, what I think was missing from that report was any sort of urgent call for more research to fill that void, right? I think that, and I think a lot of people sort of took that report as being, you know, there's something here, but there's not enough to look at it. Okay, let's move on. As opposed to, there's something here, you know, we need to really figure this out because we're facing an epidemic of chronic diet-related disease. And if this is an alternative way and a complementary way of examining the data, then we should take this opportunity to invest substantially to figure this out. That was the piece that was missing for me. I agree with the overall conclusion at this point, but I think that there really is this middle ground to really try to figure this out. We can't just go on with business as usual.
Yeah, thank you for that reflection, Kevin. I actually also wanted to pick out a question from the participants that you already reacted to, Edith, but just to make sure that everyone hears. There's a question, in NOVA category 3, we find cured meat and alcoholic beverages which are classified as carcinogenic. Is there a risk that focusing on only category 4 can deflect from other foods with more established effects? Edith, you already answered,
Well,
but maybe you could
I
reflect
already
on
answered. Yeah, I think yes, that is precisely my concern with Nova 4 at the moment. We focus on category 4, and it includes some foods which I think should be recommended to be eaten, and indeed Nova 3 concerns foods which I think should not be recommended to be eaten in large extent, and that is based on the nutrient content or also epidemiology and trial events in these the meats related with the salt and so on. And that is a little bit my concern with the whole of Nova. You can use it in addition, but if I'm typing answers as we speak now because of my voice, but if I make a cake myself from scratch, it's considered Nova 2 or 1 or 3, not ultra processed. Is it more healthy than when I buy my cake from the shop, the supermarket? I don't think so. Should we advise people, you know, to make all the cakes themselves and we are fine with our guidelines? No, I don't think so. So I mean, the Nova classification doesn't replace what we have now. We can just say, okay, we don't understand what's going on with some of our unhealthy foods or foods which perhaps we were not completely unhealthy, but we are wondering about because of the matrix, because of the texture, because of the impact on satiety, on maybe the taste, the palatability. They are really nice eating foods. If we understand that better, of course, in the end, we can give even better and more precise advice on the individual and on the national level. But so far, I think that is exactly the reason why I'm concerned. The discrepancies at places.
Yeah, yes, thank you for that reflection, Edith. I also would like to move on. And you mentioned, Edith, looking at food environments, we need brave governments. So yeah. I would like to actually pose a question to all of you on what would you advise policymakers in relation to ultra-processed food products, if you could advise on that. John, you already reflected on taxation versus subsidies, but maybe you could elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. As some of you might know, we had a review relatively recently in the UK on the food system, and that review was carried out by an independent group and presented to the government. And many of us were optimistic that this might be a way of encouraging the government to be braver about changing the food system, not only to improve the health of the population, but also to protect the planet. And what we've discovered is that our government, at least, has not been very brave. It's tinkered with the recommendations a little bit. It's done a few easy things, but it's not been prepared to take the hard decisions and make the big changes. And I think we need support, governments need support from the whole of the community. That means the food industry and the population, to say we need to make these changes for exactly the reasons that Kevin made earlier, because of this epidemic of diet-related disease. Societies really cannot afford to carry on like this. We need to make big changes to the way in which we produce and use foods. And so far, there are a few signs that at least the UK government is willing to be brave enough.
Yes, I think, thank you, John, what you said, we can't continue in this direction. So in that sense, there is a need to really act on it, as is being done slowly now in some countries. Kevin, Edith, Kevin first, would you like to reflect before we sort of round off this webinar?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about policy stuff just because I'm a government scientist. I just can't talk about that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Edith, you already talked about it, but maybe some final reflections on this topic.
Yes. Well, my final reflection is this, that we should be a little bit conservative on one hand as policymakers and base it on evidence, because it sometimes can backfire. Remember that in terms of health communication, we previously thought, let's communicate people who should eat less fat, because the concept of saturated fat is so complicated, the consumer doesn't understand. And, you know, fat is bad for obesity and cancer, so let's make the people eat less fat. Okay, that's what everybody started doing, starting in the 80s. Look now, everybody sees that, oh, well, that's what's maybe not so clever. Why, scientists, did you shout out and say it should only relate to saturated fat, and then not monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat? And then the scientists said, yes, we said that, but the policymakers and the health communication people said it was too complicated, so that's why. So, I mean, as a nutrition scientist, I feel, you know, we should give advice based on what we know and also based on what we don't know. And then it's perhaps even a politics decision to take the risk or not take the risk. In like I said, in case of the Nova 4 group or the group 4, I think the risk is in the end not that big, but in terms of precautionary principle. But then the untoward effects may be that later we will be, it will be clear that not all Nova 4 is bad, and also other foods which are not in Nova 4, they are bad, and why you scientists didn't advise us at that time, and now 10 years later we have a new problem. And also, I alluded to that last time. I mean, some of these foods we eat for convenience. So overall, I would be very, happy to hear from the public health nutrition people. How do they see this happening? Cooking all from scratch is impossible. So that's exaggerating. Cooking from scratch is overall impossible, and especially within families who don't have much time. So a lot of these foods are also produced because they are convenient, and because they are produced in large amounts. They are relatively cheap. I do, however, think that the government should do something on the marketing, and indeed should do something on the pricing related to the foods which are now, we have good enough evidence that they are unhealthy, like the sugar sweetened beverages, and also, like we discussed with John, making fruits and vegetables, for example, cheaper. So I think there's a lot the government can do and policymakers can endorse. Well, yeah, these are the most memorable things, I think, which can be done tomorrow.
Yes, and I think that is the bottom line, and I'm also going to round off with that, but I hear you all mention there is some evidence, we need to act, we need brave governments, so there is already something we can go on, and we need to act as a food, nutrition, and health community. I really would like to thank you for this interesting discussion, for these different perspectives. Kevin Hall, John Mathers, Edith Veskens, thank you all for being on this panel. Thank you.
Sorry, Jasmina, can we stay on this Zoom, because I still haven't gone through the Q&A.
Well,
Is it
actually,
possible to still do the answers on the questions in the Q&A?
Actually, we need to round up the webinar, but we can reflect on the questions that we haven't answered, and we'll share them with the participants.
Yeah, because I would love to do that, but yeah, I didn't finish them all.
Yes, sure. That's so for the participants, we will get back to you with some of the unanswered questions. Also, please fill in the survey that when you close this webinar, will come onto your screen, and please it will only take a minute to fill it in, but will help us to maybe provide you with follow-up webinars if necessary. And I would, like to thank everyone for this interesting discussion, and happy to have been able to moderate this. And I would like to close the webinar and see you again in another webinar online, hopefully.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.